Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's See You on the Weekend webinar entitled, Where Have You Experienced Biology Today? We'll be starting the program in just a couple of minutes, leaving a little more time for everyone to get logged on. Thanks for your patience, and we'll be back shortly.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to See You on the Weekend, an ongoing series of lectures featuring cutting-edge research and creative work of CU Boulder's world-class faculty. Today's webinar is titled, Where Have You Experienced Biology Today? My name is David Means, and I'll be your moderator. I'm the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which sponsors this series. We're so glad you could join us for today's program. A few logistics before we get started. Attendees may submit questions by clicking the question and answer or Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom window. These will be sent to the presenter and the moderators for their consideration and will not be visible to other audience members. Due to the size of the audience for this program, the chat function has been disabled for the talk. We may not have time to get to your question, but we'll certainly do our best to address the themes and ideas that are most common. So we encourage you all to submit questions as they come to you throughout the talk. That gives the folks that are helping us out on the back end of the webinar to collect those in order most common, most popular, and we can make sure to address those. The webinar is being recorded, and there will be a link to the recording on our website. That'll be available on Monday. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Melanie Peffer has a BS and a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Pittsburgh, and she completed postdoctoral training in learning sciences at Georgia State University. She's a teaching assistant professor with the Health Professions Residential Academic Program and a research scientist level 2 with the Institute of Cognitive Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Peffer's research is focused on how people learn biology with an emphasis on teaching about the nature of science knowledge and how we can use educational technologies to assess students' understanding of science. Peffer is the author of the best-selling book, Biology Everywhere: How the Science of Life Matters to Everyday Life. She was also the 2021 High Plains Library District Foundation's Writer in Residence and spent her residency working on a children's series called The Biology Adventure. On the River, which launched in December 2021, Peffer's outreach work includes coaching others about how to communicate science with the general public and developing educational content with TED-ED. She also gave a talk at TEDxCU in 2021. We're very lucky to have Professor Peffer with us, and I will hand things over to her now.
All right, well, thank you, David, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And also thank you to the Office of Outreach for having me. I'm really excited to share the work I've been doing over the last couple of years with you. I'm really excited about it. I'm excited that you're here to learn about it today. So I'm going to take you on a journey today that is part research talk, part talk about my outreach work and my book, and a little bit of autobiographical story as well. So before I get started, I'll pull up my social media information again at the end, but if you want to follow me, I'm always posting little tidbits about things. So feel free to follow me as well. So let's start the talk today by meeting Alex. So Alex might be like a person you know, like a student that you have, a friend, or a family member. And Alex doesn't like science. Alex thinks science is just a bunch of facts that they have to memorize. And you know what? Alex didn't get a COVID vaccine either, because Alex's uncle said that COVID vaccines aren't safe, so they're not going to get one. Alex doesn't think we can trust any scientific evidence because the people who peer review are bought off by big pharma. And Alex doesn't wear a mask either, because Alex is confused about these changing mask recommendations. And Alex wants to know why the CDC can't just follow the scientific method and give us an answer. So these thoughts that Alex has, these ones that I've highlighted in blue, are all referring to different kinds of epistemological beliefs about science, beliefs we have about the nature of science knowledge and how we get that knowledge through inquiry. And this other one, this idea of not liking science and how people feel about science and how they identify as a science person, is what I'm doing with my Biology Everywhere project. So how did I become interested in Alex and in working with people? And so it started when I was a doctoral student, and I earned my PhD in molecular biology, and I got halfway through graduate school and I realized I just wasn't in the right place. I loved biology, I loved education, I loved teaching, but I knew I didn't want to be in a lab full time. And I knew I didn't want to be in a classroom full time. So I started exploring, and that led me to teaching at the Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium. And I started asking myself these questions of, how do I translate what I do in a lab during the week into a classroom? Or said otherwise, how do we give authentic science research experiences to students? And so that's when I entered the world of educational technology and developed the science classroom inquiry simulations. You'll hear more about those today, which is a way of giving students an authentic science inquiry experience in the context of a classroom, and also provides us a way of getting data about how they learn. So this led to a postdoc in the learning sciences, and then eventually on to a faculty position. And so this was my first conference that I attended as a faculty member, asking a question with someone who I highly respect in my field staring at me. So I always like that picture that someone captured. So as you can kind of surmise, since I went from molecular biology into the learning sciences, so going from the hard sciences into the soft sciences, and now kind of working at that interface, it was a bit of an interesting transition. So it's not research I'm going to talk about today. You're welcome to look up my paper or my NSF grant on this. But I wanted to bring it up, even though I'm not going to talk about this work today, because I think this lens will make sense as I talk about the work that I'm doing throughout my entire seminar today. Okay, so let's just start with a brief overview of some of the research that I've done on epistemological beliefs about science. So again, epistemological beliefs, this is a philosophical term. So epistemology being, the nature of knowledge and knowing. And so when we think about this in terms of science, it's how we know something in science. What do we know as a science fact versus someone's opinion about science? And so I'll be sharing kind of the key result from each of 3 of my biggest papers in the last couple of years. So why do we even care about epistemological beliefs about science? And it's because our belief systems underlie the decisions that we make and how we make them. And we don't have a choice but to engage with biology and science as part of our daily lives. It's a big theme you'll hear me talk about today. There's decisions about vaccinating. This is stuff that isn't new with the COVID vaccines. This is stuff that's been going on for over 20 years now. There's the plastic bag bans that I'm going to bring up today, and about reusability, and are reusable products really greener? COVID really brought this to the forefront. We all had to start making biologically minded decisions every day. There's not a single aspect of our lives where this hasn't been affected. For those of you who live in Colorado, you know that the decision to reintroduce gray wolves into Colorado was on the ballots last year, or 2 years ago now, it was in 2020. Big biological issue. I don't need to tell anybody in the Boulder community that forest fires and wildfires are a big issue, as well as drought, hurricanes. And then again, this idea of the decision to reuse or not. We cloth diapered my son. That was a decision that we have to make. And our beliefs underlie what we do in each of these situations and how we manage it. So epistemological beliefs are broken down into 4 different dimensions. So first we have the source. Where do we get our information? So Alex sees her uncle or their uncle as a trusted source. And that gets into what's called in-group and out-group bias as well. We're more likely to believe a source that's someone who seems to be like us. And oftentimes people don't identify as science people. So it's much easier for them to get their science information from their favorite political party, their friends, or somewhere else. Then we have the justification of science knowledge. So this is how we justify we know something, how we use evidence to back something up. And we have certainty. This is a big one. This comes out quite a bit. And it's this idea that science knowledge changes over time. And it makes sense why people think that once we know something in science, we know it forever. And we see the size of textbooks, for example. In my book, I use the example of the molecular biology of the cell, which is this huge textbook. And it makes you think we know everything there is to know about cell biology, but we really don't. And so what we know changes in light of new evidence. And sometimes people see that as political hem-hawing rather than just that's how science works. And then finally, we get to the structure of science knowledge, where people feel that science is just a bunch of facts they have to memorize. That's one of the biggest downfalls, specifically in biology. So a lot of people think biology is just a bunch of terms that have to be memorized. Whereas in reality, it's actually a lot of interconnected structures. Things are related to one another. Things are dependent on one another. It's more than just a list of abstract concepts. So these beliefs are important. They're going to underlie what we do, but beliefs are kind of sticky. It's hard to put your hands on there and say, well, what do you believe? Because sometimes people can't even fully articulate what they believe. So how on earth do we measure it? And how do we measure it in a way that's quantitative and high throughput and also going to give us data that we believe is true, reliable data? So let's come back to the science classroom inquiry or science simulations that I mentioned before that I developed while working at the zoo. So these give students an authentic inquiry experience within the constraints and confines of the typical classroom. It runs as a web app. You can log on to it. It's hosted through the University of Colorado. You can do it yourself if you'd like to. And it scaffolds authentic inquiry. And that's one of the biggest challenges to giving students authentic inquiry experiences in the classroom, is that there's just not the resources available to do it. And this kind of helps hold students up so that they can. They're looking at real world data with real world problems in an authentic, nonlinear format. So just like real scientists, if their results aren't working out the way they had hoped, they can start over again, generate a new hypothesis, and go, go in a different direction. It also allows for a nonlinear format too. They can choose which tests, which order they do, how many they do. And here's the key. They all do something very different. And it allows us a very rich source of data so that we can look at their inquiry processes and, more importantly, their epistemology in real time. So rather than asking them, what do you believe? We look at their beliefs through what they're doing. Okay, so what does this look like? So this is a video from an older build of the SCI simulation. If you happen to go to the current build of the SCI simulation, which is on my website, you'll see something that looks different, but this gives you a general idea. So you can see the test page there, and the person is saying why they want to do this test. They get information. They go look for more information out on the web. This is called an information seeking decision. It's very important, we found. So the more people look for more information, the more sophisticated their epistemological beliefs tend to be, which is interesting. So now they're saying their hypothesis is refuted. So they decide to generate a new hypothesis. So we can see what kind of evidence they want to do and what their next hypothesis is going to be. So there's our testing page again. They go back and look for information. So now they decide to look at manatees, which is another form of marine mammal. Let's look up information about manatees, read about this form of algae that's found in their stomach. So now they think their hypothesis is supportive. So they're going to do another test now. We're going to look at algal blooms. You can see how there's some logic to this, how they're doing these different tests. So then again, this is real world data from a citizen science project that they're reviewing. And now they're all set and ready to make those conclusions. So each of those steps that they take, everything that they click on, everything that they type in gets saved by the SCI simulation engine. And then we can analyze that investigative approach. So I'll be showing some of these investigative approaches in just a minute. So these are in the field called data traces. These are the traces that students leave when they engage in some kind of computer activity. So what do these data traces and learning analytics, which is the general term for using these data traces to make inferences about learning, tell us about what people believe and the nature of science knowledge? So one of the papers I mentioned at the beginning, we look specifically at language and how students used language when they made their conclusions. And one thing that we noticed was that experts always use what are called by linguists are hedges. A hedge is a term that implies some kind of tentativeness, or we're not sure about it. And that's what experts use. They say things like, this might support my idea. This may be the answer. Novices both don't use hedges. They arguably use language that's a little bit more firm. So things like, that causes this. And then we also looked at investigative approach. So the first study I'm going to mention was a slightly smaller study. And we were looking at the number of hypotheses they generated, when they decided to make their conclusions, when they looked for information, and when they did a test. And then, so when this data pops up, these are to scale. So every time you see one little box that's this side, that's one test. So here's our novices. And so these are novices that did a simple investigation. So this is an investigation that really looks like those textbook lab experiments that we all did in school. And so some of them did very little. One hypothesis, one test, one conclusion, I'm done. This novice did a little bit more. They looked for information once. And then we had some other novices. This one looked for quite a bit of information, but really only did 2 tests. So pretty straightforward investigations, but not all of our novices were that way. And when I say novices are experts here, I mean novice or expert at authentic science practices. So these were undergraduates with no research experience whatsoever. So when we look at the complex novices, so these are novices, undergraduates who chose to do investigations that look more like what we see real scientists do. And we start to see more of the gray boxes. We also start to see this zebra striping pattern where they go from a hypothesis to a test, looking for information to a test, information, test, information. Oh, they went and generated a new hypothesis. And again, we see more of that zebra striping pattern. So let's compare this to our experts. So experts in this case were just defined as senior graduate students or postdoctoral scholars, someone who had published a first author, meaning they did most of the work, peer-reviewed paper. So even our simple experts show more information seeking than our simple novices do. When we look at the complex experts, we see these very long periods of information seeking. We also see these planning phases that go on before they even generate their first hypothesis. And what's interesting about this is that even though this is in the context of biology, this is consistent with research that's been done in expert novice studies and engineering education as well. So why these patterns? Why are undergraduates who are roughly similar to one another very different in their practices? Why do some look more like experts than others do? And more importantly, this is 16 people done by a hand. How do we make generalizable information? How do we capture the information of hundreds and maybe even eventually thousands of individuals to really understand what's going on here and how these differences in practices can tell us about the things that they know? Okay, so working with a colleague who's also at CU, we decided to take a machine learning approach to ask these questions. And so we did something called k-means clustering. And so this was a different group of students. These were students in Colorado instead of in Georgia, because that last study was during my postdoc. This was done during my faculty position in Colorado. And so it's a way of kind of giving the computer a set of data and asking, okay, what kind of groups do we see fall out? And so when we put in the data of biology majors, non-STEM majors, which are roughly equivalent to our novices in the previous study, and our biology graduates, which are roughly equivalent to the experts in the previous study, we see 3 clusters. And so just like on the last slide, except now we have color-coded it, we're looking at information seeking, hypothesis generation, testing, and when they made their conclusions. So our first cluster we see, not a lot going on here. They don't really make a lot of actions. So these are students who did less than 10 things, 10 separate things during the activity, and they don't really make a lot of transitions. We don't see that zebra striping pattern we saw before. So you can see that all of them started with a hypothesis, did a couple tests, and concluded. We see a little bit of activity here where people generated multiple hypotheses. We only see one person who looked for information. So then in the second cluster, it looks fairly similar to the first one in that we don't see a lot of information seeking. We only see one person that did any planning, but they do an awful lot more testing. They seem to be much more rigorous in their evaluation of what's going on. And then finally, we get to cluster 3. And the big thing to notice here is look at all the blue. This is our information seeking cluster. We also see, unlike our first 2 clusters, that most people in this one started with planning, which again, we know from other studies that have been done from our previous work, that that's a very expert-like behavior. Okay, so let's break this down by expertise then, educational background. So here's our biology graduates, which are equivalent to our experts in the old study, biology majors, and our non-STEM majors, which are equivalent to the novices. And so what's interesting is that we don't see that everybody in the expert or the biology graduate group was doing these more sophisticated studies. We see it present in all three of these groups, which is interesting because it's bringing up this idea of how much does educational background really influence practices and also beliefs. We did see that there was a statistical association between their background and their cluster assignment, although we do still, again, see people that are more sophisticated in each group. But most importantly is that there is a statistical association between complexity and cluster assignment. And complexity, again, is whether or not the students did an investigation that looks like what scientists really do. And so that's going to tell us about individuals' beliefs about the justification, so how we use evidence to justify what we know, and the structure, so having different facts versus having things that are interconnected, kind of like what we saw in the video. So this is telling us that these clustering assignments is giving us some insight into beliefs these individuals have about the justification and structure of science knowledge. And I've got a wonderful undergraduate student who's working with me this semester. One of the things we've been talking about is getting in a little bit more into the other epistemological beliefs and things like certainty, and beginning to tease those out as well. So that's all I want to say on my research on epistemological beliefs about science. Does anyone have any questions before we continue?
So Melanie, one question, a participant named Beverly has asked a question that might be helpful for orienting other folks if they're having the same thought. Beverly writes, I'm wondering if this is only going to be about research. I guess I didn't understand the title. So in terms of the subject matter of the talk and how this fits in, how does this learning research that you're discussing now fit into where we're going to go next?
Yeah, so Beverly, that's a great question. And I think it underlies where we're going to go next because, like I said at the beginning, I really care about how people interact and engage with and understand science. And part of how I do that is through this research and understanding people's beliefs about research and their attitudes about research. And so the talk is going to take a real turn in just a minute. So it's not just research, but the research that I do underlies my approach to outreach and why I do the outreach that I do, and also why the approach that I'm taking with science communication, which is going to be at the very, very end of the talk.
Great. And another question that's maybe logistical. Someone asked, where are the questions posted? And they might have missed the opening when we clarified that the questions that you submit will be seen by the moderators and posed to our speaker, but will not be visible to the whole audience. So some clarification there. A question that came in early from a participant named John, Professor Peffer. I'll read this. It's actually a statement that I think you likely have an interesting response to. John writes, anti-intellectualism has been in our country since its founding and now is only worse with social media and certain political beliefs. So is there room, this is the question part, I was wrong. So is there room for optimism that humans, especially adults, can unlearn their patterns of anti-intellectualism?
Yeah, John, I'm glad you asked that question. And that's also something I'm going to be coming back to at the end of the talk, because I'll be bringing up misinformation and disinformation. I feel like as a teacher, there's always room for optimism. That's where my educational background is coming in. I was actually talking with my husband about this morning and some content we're going to be covering in my classes and what I'm hoping that it turns into. I strongly believe that when we lose our optimism and we lose our hope, that it's giving up. There's that story that people like to talk about with the starfish and throwing, you can't throw all the starfish back in the ocean, but you can throw some. And so I try to teach to the students in front of me. And I talk about this stuff a lot. And I'm glad that, there's close to 100 people here today who are also hearing about this and thinking about it. Because if each person says something about this to someone else or thinks about it or comes to my talks on how to use scientific evidence, so some of the evidence about epistemological beliefs, for example, when they're talking about science, and thinking about motivated reasoning and thinking about bias, I think when you plant those seeds with people, even if you initially get some pushback, they start to think about it. And it's my hope that the more people who start to think about it tell someone else, that gets that person to start to think about it, and that's how we make change in the world.
Great. So at this point, maybe one more question, Professor Peffer, and then we'll move on to the next section. Is that?
Sure.
So a participant named Jasper has asked, what does the gap between educational background and beliefs that lead to seeking out information tell you about what types of people will get involved in science in the future?
Oh, that's such a good question, Jasper. So if you dig into the CBE paper that came out in late 2020, we talk about this quite a bit because we see a science identity is playing a huge role in what people are doing in the simulation. And one of the things we're trying to tease out right now is how identity and is influencing beliefs and influencing practices, because something that I'm concerned about that we're looking with the data and that we're trying to control for is that somebody who doesn't feel like a science person isn't going to seek out information, or they're not going to get as involved in the simulation. And so it's a confound that we're trying to control for, as well as something we're trying to understand more. And that's something I'll actually be talking quite a bit more about in the rest of the talk when I'm talking about biology everywhere, and how to get people to feel more like a science person so that they're more likely to seek out information. And so again, that gets back to one of the first questions that was asked by Beverly about making these connections. And that's one of those connections that are here.
Okay, great. So we have a couple more questions than we're able to get to in this segment. Just to remind everyone, we will have room for more discussion at the end of the talk. So hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those questions that we didn't get to in this segment. But thank you all for your contributions to that. We're continuing to track those. Okay,
so let's return to Alex and this idea that Alex doesn't like science. And so if we were all in the same room, I would ask you to raise your hands right now and say, how many of you have ever felt like you don't like science? Which might be a biased sample because you did come to a science talk on a Saturday, but you could also ask how many of you are in the audience who know someone who says they don't like science. And so one of my first assignments as a professor was working with non-majors biology. And something I do with all of my students is the first week of classes, I try to get to know them better. And I ask them, we do what are called exit tickets, so our quick writes at the end of class. I just ask questions about what they're looking forward to. And I always put at the end, is there anything I need to know? And semester after semester after semester, the first week of classes, the students were always telling me, I hate science. I'm not good at this. I'm afraid to take your course. I'm terrible at science. And my personal favorite, I have learned to hate science. So this what ended up becoming the title of a commentary I wrote in the American Biology Teacher. I used a lot of these direct student quotes when I gave my TED Talk last year. And every semester, this is what the students were coming in saying. I'm not a fan of this. I'm not good. I'm not confident. I'm not interesting. And so this was hard for me to hear. Both as somebody who loves biology and teaching, as a researcher, and kind of wondering where did these feelings come from? Why do people feel this way? What do we do about it? And so I completely changed my teaching approach with these students. And I really changed it to thinking about, because it's non-majors. So I had music majors, and I had criminal justice majors, and I had education, and really thinking about, why does the business major care about biology? Why does I had a heart performance major one semester. Why does a heart performance major care about biology? And so I started to make class geared around those questions. And it was amazing, the difference in the students from the first week of classes to the last week of classes. So we went from, I'm not good at this, I'm terrible at biology, I suck at biology, to this was my first positive experience in a biology class. And so that is what informed biology everywhere. I took that approach that worked so well for my students and wrote it up as a book. So Biology Everywhere it covers kind of the content you'd see in an introductory biology course, but not in the way that you'd expect to see it. It's biology as we see it as part of our daily lives. And it's also biology in the places we least expect. And that's actually my favorite part of the book. So the last third of the book is biology that intersects with other disciplines. Biology in the arts, biology in business, biology in psychology, biology in education. And it's also underlined my children's book that just came out in December, On the River. I'll talk more about it in a little bit, but it's helping children to build a sense of identity with science by starting with the place where they live. And so if you're real sharp, you can go along the Poudre River with a copy of this book and pick out the scenes that are actually in northern Colorado, because it's designed to foster that sense of place so that people can feel more like a scientist in their own environments, and also a sense of stewardship for our natural resources here in Colorado as well. So both of these books have the Biology Everywhere philosophy at their core. And so it's this idea of presenting biology from the standpoint of our daily experiences, and also as they intersect with other disciplines. So it makes content accessible because it's relatable. And when content is accessible and relatable, it helps people build confidence to engage with biology. They can get past those feelings of I'm not good enough, because they start to see that they really do biology everywhere, every day. And we need that engagement. The more confident people are, the more they're going to engage. And this is really important for the health and welfare of society. It's been a major theme through this whole talk, is that we don't have a choice but to engage with biology as part of our lives. So I'm going to give 2 examples of the Biology Everywhere philosophy. And the first one is applying this philosophy through our daily experiences. And I'm going to pick one that always really strongly resonated with my students, and that's the decision to reuse things or not. This is something that comes up quite a bit that people talk about. So we're going to have a chance for a little bit of audience interaction. So we're going to have a poll. So tell me, what are some things that you reuse rather than use it once and dispose? Okay, so it looks like most people are reusing Ziploc bags and grocery bags. See, water bottles and mason and pickle jars are pretty high on the list as well. Rubber bands. Not many people are using diapers, which makes sense unless you have small kids in the household. Takeout containers. So it looks like we've got a lot of people who reuse. Wrapping paper and plastic utensils are also on here too. Wonderful. So something that's been in the newspapers on and off over the last couple of years is the Kroger company's decision to ban plastic bags. And so Kroger owns King Soopers here in Colorado. And so this is something that's going to be happening here too. I think there's different municipalities around Colorado who've already done this. I'm pretty sure Fort Collins has a plastic bag ban. And again, this is making national news. So we have news from Tennessee, from Georgia, national news, ABC, New York. But are reusable bags actually greener than plastic bags? So I'm going to share a video real quick. This is up on YouTube. This was a video that was done in collaboration with a CU Boulder student who has since graduated and moved on to doing more educational videos like this. But let's explore this issue a little bit further.
Biology, or the science of life, is part of our daily experience. This video covers one topic that falls under ecology, a subfield of biology. Ecology studies how life is interconnected with one another. In fact, decisions you make on a daily basis can impact other organisms around you in many ways. Let's examine one of these issues a little bit more in depth: the decision to use a reusable bag when shopping.
You are at the grocery store standing in the checkout line, and a cashier asks you, "Do you want to purchase a reusable bag today?" The way I see it, there are three ways to respond. A, yes. B, no. Or C, have an existential crisis, wondering if it's worth it. For the minority of you that chose option C, congratulations, you're in the right place. You are also in the right place if you answered yes and are now wondering what you're going to do with your 27th reusable bag that you will forget to bring to the store next time, just like you have the previous 26 times. Let's start by exploring our options. At any grocery store, we have our usual plastic bags. Maybe they also have paper bags. And lastly, we have our reusable bags. For the purposes of this, we're going to be talking about non-woven polypropylene bags, which is what most reusable bags are made out of. Let's assume that no matter what bag we use, we're just going to use it once. Obviously, that's not the purpose of a reusable bag, but just bear with me. When a bag is manufactured, it takes materials, energy, natural resources, and a variety of other things. However, once a bag is made, its environmental impact is not finished. At some point, a bag may end up in landfill or recycling or be repurposed. And what happens when a bag is no longer being used is still an important factor to consider. So we'll be looking at the life cycle of any bag holistically. Let's focus on three ways that it affects our environment: global warming potential, which is a fancy way of saying CO2 produced, energy usage, and fossil fuel depletion. A single plastic reusable bag costs about 0.2 kilograms of CO2 to produce. Your paper bag is about 0.8 kilograms of CO2, and your reusable bag is about 2.6 kilograms. For all us Americans watching this, 1 kilogram is about 2.2 pounds, or about 9 quarter pounders with cheese without the cheese bun or anything on it. The amount of energy it takes to make a plastic bag is 5 megajoules. Paper takes 23 megajoules, and a reusable bag takes 53 megajoules. For perspective, 53 megajoules is the amount of energy it takes to overcook your 20-pound Thanksgiving turkey by 30 minutes or so, making it just slightly too dry for your mother-in-law to approve. The amount of oil a plastic bag depletes in its lifetime is about 100 grams. A paper bag depletes about 200 grams, and a reusable bag about 1,100 grams. 1,100 grams is the same amount of oil that it takes to produce enough gasoline to travel 4 miles in a 2016 Ford Explorer, or infinite miles in a Tesla, assuming you don't run out of battery. Now that you know this information, let's come back to the question at hand. How many times do you need to use a reusable bag to make it worth it? In comparison to a plastic bag, about 37 times. As a side note, I looked into cotton totes as well, and you need to use those 7,100 times before it becomes worth it.
What happens after you've used your bag of choice? Well, reusable bags can be, reused. In fact, I know of a reusable bag that has been in continuous use for over 10 years. Plastic or paper bags can be reused or repurposed as trash can liners, or if facilities exist, recycled. And paper bags can be composted or turned back into raw organic material. This is also known as dirt. However, the majority of plastic bags are never recycled. Waste Management estimates that only 1% of the 100 billion plastic bags that Americans use in any year are recycled. This means that the rest are taking up room in landfills or littering our communities, oceans, and closets. Plastic bags take 10 to 20 years to break down, and in that time, they leach microscopic plastics into the environment that can eventually work their way into our food and bodies. They are also suffocation hazards not only to us, but to other animals as well. The issue of which type of plastic bag to use at stores is one we face in today's society, and it's a pretty hot topic right now. Have you seen any of the headlines recently? There's a lot about plastic bag bans. Sometimes making green decisions isn't always straightforward. Whatever we choose to do, it influences the balance of life on Earth. Reusable bags take more energy to produce, but are more earth-friendly in the long run. If you can remember to bring your bag with you to the store, that is. Plastic bags take little energy and money to produce, but shed microplastics, pose suffocation hazards, and tend not to be recycled, therefore end up as litter in our landfills. Sometimes it's hard to know what to do with this information. But the idea should be that whatever type of bag you have, to try and use it as many times as possible and repurpose it if you can. Do you even need a bag, or can you carry your items in your bag or purse that you already have with you? Or carry it to your car with your hands and then recycle.
If you found this interesting and would
So we can see that there's a lot of push for these plastic bag bans, but at the end of the day, unless people actually commit to reusing products, and this applies to all the products, because anything that's reusable is going to cost more money up front, take more resources to produce, you have to commit to actually using it. And we see this really pertinently with the plastic bags, because I mean, I'm guilty of forgetting my bags too. I usually tend to carry a big bag with me anyway, so I'll often just shove stuff in my purse, but it's not as straightforward as we think it is, because it requires some bigger behavioral changes for people to actually be willing to wash things or be willing to remember them. And it gets even more complicated. It actually becomes a bit of a social justice issue as well. And so we're going to play the Price is Right. So I'd like to ask for a volunteer from the audience to come on down and guess some prices. And so if you would like to volunteer, go ahead and raise your hand, and Gretchen will unmute you.
Mary Russell, you are our winner.
All right, Mary, thank you for volunteering today. So our first guest is going to be with diapers. So how much do you think a all-in-one cloth diaper costs? So this is a Colorado made diaper versus a case of disposable diapers.
I think an all-in-one diaper, a case.
So just
Oh,
one,
just
a
one.
single diaper.
Okay, all-in-one diaper probably costs $12.
$12, okay. And how much do you think a case of diapers would be if you went to Target right now?
Probably the same.
$12, okay.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't buy them, but anyway.
All right, well, the next ones are a little bit more general. So now we have a poll so everyone can chime in, because on the Real Price is Right, people yell higher or lower. So let's see our poll. Okay, so it's pretty evenly split between higher and lower. All right, so hold on to that thought. Now, how about sandwich bags? So a lot of people said in the beginning that they reuse sandwich bags. So how much do you think, again, a Colorado-made reusable sandwich bag costs versus a case of disposables from Target?
One of those bags, reusable sandwich bags, probably costs $8,
Okay,
at least at Whole Foods. And a box of disposable sandwich bags, under $3.
okay. So less than 3. All right, everyone, higher or lower? So most people are thinking higher. All right, let's do one more. So how about water bottles? So we have our fancy Swell water bottles versus just buying a case of bottled water.
Aluminum water bottle, $18. a case of bottled water, which I've never purchased.
Good for you.
$10.
$10. Okay, so for the last time, everyone, higher or lower? So we're split again. Some people are saying higher, some people are saying lower. Okay, so Mary, thank you for participating. Let's see how you did. So diapers more expensive on both fronts. So a single all-in-one cloth diaper is about $25, the same cost as a full case of disposable diapers. A single sandwich bag is about $6 versus about 9 or 10 for a case. And then Swell water bottles in particular, which now I'm getting a ton of ads for because I looked it up, are about $35 versus $5 to $6 for a case of bottled water. So things that are reusable cost a lot more money up front, even though in the long run it will save you money. And so this is where the social justice issue comes in. And so again, I have a young son, so he's potty trained now, but thought a lot about this when we decided a cloth diaper. So as part of the research I did for the book, I talked to a lot of people in the cloth diapering community. And there are people I talk to that cloth diaper their kids with the cloth diapers that their parents used on them when they were babies. And so you can buy all the cloth diapers you'll ever need for a couple $100s. However, not everyone has a couple $100 up front at one time. And so then people get into buying a case every week because they can afford $25 a week. They might not be able to afford $300-400 up front. But when you do the math, using disposable diapers ends up being $3,000 or so, depending on what brand you use, per child. And they all end up in landfills. Same thing with sandwich bags or the water bottles. Yes, $35 is a lot more money up front, but you can reuse it indefinitely, especially the aluminum water bottles. I mean, we really beat ours up. We use them all the time and they work fine. Versus a case of bottled water where, that's 24 plastic bottles that may or may not end up being recycled. And that's a question that I get a lot from students. Well, I recycle my plastic water bottles, so it's okay for me to buy bottled water by the case. But it's not just what you're doing, it fits into a bigger picture with society and economy. And unfortunately, a lot of goods that are recyclable don't get recycled because it doesn't make financial sense. This is a big problem with glass, for example, and glass is not a renewable resource. We can recycle glass indefinitely, but the sand that's used to make glass is not a renewable resource. But it costs too much to recycle glass. So we end up driving our glass to one of the local breweries that takes it so that we can recycle it. I'm also a big supporter of some of the companies that have started taking some of the plastic waste that comes available and turning it into useful products. So both Green Toys and Replay buy bulk previously used plastic and turns it into new products. And so that creates a market for this bulk material. So even though it is recyclable, it's being turned into something else instead of being recyclable, not having a market for it and sending it to the landfill anyway. And landfill space is also not a renewable resource. So daily experiences is part of my kids' books. I mentioned this a little bit already, the strong focus on identity for children. And it's written for that late elementary grade, which research tells us is when the girls start to fall behind the boys, the children of color start to fall behind their white peers. We start to see these gaps open up. And I wanted to go with a picture book specifically because I feel like picture books appeal to a very broad range. And there's a lot of parents who don't feel good about science, but will buy science books for their kids. And it's a way to kind of sneak them in as well, get the science message to them. And so we followed the journey of a brother and sister duo. And so we have Max here, and Max doesn't like science. This is his I don't like science face. He heard from the kids at school that it was hard and he just doesn't want to do it. He wants to build model airplanes. You can see he's got his airplane pajamas on, and then his big sister Ellie comes in and she loves science and she wants her brother Max to go with her down to the river because she's going to earn her adventurer badge. And so these are all the things that they're going to check on their adventure. And so over the course of the day, Max starts to learn and realize that science isn't what he thought it was. And so the book's designed to be really hands-on for kids. So again, that building that strong sense of play so that they can take their book out to rivers in Colorado or really anywhere. It's more designed to be Colorado-based. The illustrations are based on Colorado, but I tried to pick examples that would apply to any river ecosystem. And a lot of the language that goes on is based on me listening to kids play in the rivers and hear how they talk. And so they get a chance to, they find this macroinvertebrate. And so you can see the hand holding it up. And so this is when the kids would look at it and say, okay, well, what kind of tail is it? Is this mayfly or a damselfly larvae? There's a trail guide at the end so that kids can go and be like, oh, that's an osprey. I can see the osprey carrying the fish in the particular way they carry fish, or great blue herons. Those are probably the two waterfowl I see the most, with the exception of geese. You see them everywhere. And also talking about bugs and why we need mosquitoes, and also some rare sites, things that I've seen in Colorado, but they're a little harder, like kingfisher. So again, building that sense of identity, building the sense of this is part of my daily life. So these kids begin to feel more like a science person at a critical developmental window when kids stop feeling like a science person. Okay, questions about this segment of the talk?
So there's a couple of questions, Professor Peffer, that have to do with the question of reusable products or materials. And Lynn has posed one which raises this interesting question of cultural context, I think. Lynn asked, why not use the previous generation's diapers and other things, which no doubt is done internationally?
I think, Lynn, again, thank you for your question. And this comes from being in the cloth diaper community. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what cloth diapering means right now. So if I talk to people who are my parents' age, who remembered being cloth diapered and seeing diapers soaking in the toilet or plastic pants, and people still think that it's pins and plastic pants, and that's not the case anymore. And so I know a lot of people who use what are called pre-folds now, and that's kind of your traditional diaper. And we just know a lot more now and have moved towards snappies and reusable covers. And anytime we traveled, we would do disposable diapers with a cloth diaper cover over it. And then also now we have those all-in-one diapers as well that work just like a disposable diaper. And you can get them with Velcro as well. And so they work exactly like a disposable. And so it just goes on and off like a regular diaper would. So a lot of people use those for the convenience. So it has the convenience of a disposable diaper without the environmental impact. I think there's also more information about cleaning them. I think that was a big sticking point for me when we first got into it. There's diaper services that exist in Colorado. We realized that was a waste of money. But I think that as more people talk about it and realize that it's not what people think it is, that we're going to see more adoption of it, because it really does save a ton of money over time, and disposable diapers stick around for thousands of years. And it grosses me out that there are landfills in Pennsylvania somewhere that have every diaper that I used as a baby, and that kind of grosses me out a little bit.
So some of the questions we're receiving, I think, relate back to questions about research and misinformation and the reliability of sort of independent research folks are doing on their own. I'm wondering if perhaps we ought to hold those for the discussion at the end, since it sort of has an arc back to that first segment. If we take that approach, then I think we could acknowledge, so Mary has offered maybe an inspiring proof of concept as an exemplar. She's written that in over 20 years of using reusable bags, excuse me, I still have 3 I started with, and I've never forgotten a bag when I go shopping.
Mary, that's awesome. Way to go. I still have the original reusable bags I bought in college when I first started grocery shopping for myself. And David, I also agree with you because I'm looking at Kit's question in the Q&A window right now. We're going to come full circle with that at the end of my talk, and because I'll be bringing up misinformation and disinformation and what we do next.
Great. So with that, perhaps we can save the other questions that are coming in for the final Q&A section, which we'll get to shortly, if that sounds good to you, Melanie.
Okay, that sounds good to me. All right, so I mentioned there's two parts of the biology of where philosophy, and so we just talked about where we see biology as part of our daily lives. And now let's give an example of where we see biology intersecting with other disciplines. And in specific, a discipline that's very close to my heart as a musician, the intersection of biology and the arts. So we're going to do another poll. So do we have any artists or musicians present today? We did our best to come up with an inclusive list. I know we're probably missing things, but what are some artsy things that you like to do? We've got, looks like a lot of instrumentalists. So I play flute and piccolo. And then it looks like photography and other are our next two big ones. We've got some singers present, as well as some painters and dancers. I just started, I guess I can't say that anymore. It's been almost a year now since I joined a dance studio. I've wanted to my whole life. And I'm steadily learning how to tap dance. All right, wonderful. Thank you for sharing, everyone. So a lot of people think science and the arts are separate, and you have to choose one or the other. We're kind of going through this while we're trying to choose which kindergarten my son's going to go to next year, because he was put in the lottery to go to either a STEM magnet or an arts magnet. And so that either or has always really bothered me. And I'm not the only person who dealt with that. And so I'd like to share the story of Santiago Ramón y Cajal today. And he was a Spanish neuroscientist. He's known as the father of neuroscience, and he wanted to be an artist. And his dad said, no, you're going to medical school. And so he's well known because of these drawings. He made many, many drawings of neurons, which led to the development of the neuron doctrine, something that we would only have because of his ability to combine his artistic and scientific backgrounds together. So this is a video I generated in collaboration with TED Ed that tells Cajal's story. So let's watch it.
In the late 1860s, scientists believed they were on the verge of uncovering the brain's biggest secret. They already knew the brain controlled the body through electrical impulses. The question was, how did these signals travel through the body without changing or degrading? It seemed that perfectly transmitting these impulses would require them to travel uninterrupted along some kind of tissue. This idea, called reticular theory, imagined the nervous system as a massive web of tissue that physically connected every nerve cell in the body. Reticular theory captivated the field with its elegant simplicity, but soon a young artist would cut through this conjecture and sketch a bold new vision of how our brains work. 60 years before reticular theory was born, developments in microscope technology revealed cells to be the building blocks of organic tissue. This finding was revolutionary, but early microscopes struggled to provide additional details. The technology was especially challenging for researchers studying the brain. Soft nervous tissue was delicate and difficult to work with. And even when researchers were able to get it under the microscope, the tissue was so densely packed, it was impossible to see much. To improve their view, scientists began experimenting with special staining techniques designed to provide clarity through contrast. The most effective came courtesy of Camillo Golgi in 1873. First, Golgi hardened the brain tissue with potassium bichromate to prevent cells from deforming during handling. Then he doused the tissue in silver nitrate, which visibly accumulated in nerve cells. Known as the black reaction, Golgi's method finally allowed researchers to see the entire cell body of what would later be named the neuron. The stain even highlighted the fibrous branches that shot off from the cell in different directions. Images of these branches became hazy at the ends, making it difficult to determine exactly how they fit into the larger network. But Golgi concluded that these branches connected, forming a web of tissue comprising the entire nervous system. 14 years later, a young scientist and aspiring artist named Santiago Ramón y Cajal began to build on Golgi's work. While writing a book about microscopic imaging, he came across a picture of a cell treated with Golgi's stain. Cajal was in awe of its exquisite detail, both as a scientist and an artist. He soon set out to improve Golgi's stain even further and create more detailed references for his artwork. By staining the tissue twice in a specific time frame, Cajal found he could stain a greater number of neurons with better resolution. And what these new slides revealed would upend reticular theory. The branches reaching out from each nerve cell were not physically connected to any other tissue. So how were these individual cells transmitting electrical signals? By studying and sketching them countless times, Cajal developed a bold new hypothesis. Instead of electrical signals traveling uninterrupted across a network of fibers, he proposed that signals were somehow jumping from cell to cell in a linear chain of activation. The idea that electrical signals could travel this way was completely unheard of when Cajal proposed it in 1889. However, his massive collection of drawings supported his hypothesis from every angle. And in the mid-1900s, electron microscopy further supported this idea by revealing a membrane around each nerve cell, keeping it separate from its neighbors. This formed the basis of the neuron doctrine, which proposed the brain's tissue was made up of many discrete cells instead of one connected tissue. The neuron doctrine laid the foundation for modern neuroscience and allowed later researchers to discover that electrical impulses are constantly converted between chemical and electrical signals as they travel from neuron to neuron. Both Golgi and Cajal received the Nobel Prize for their separate but shared discoveries, and researchers still apply their theories and methods today. In this way, their legacies remain connected as discrete elements in a vast network of knowledge. For researchers, one of the most...
So again, kind of going full circle with the beginning of my talk and how science really works in the real world, when Golgi and Cajal gave their speeches when they got the Nobel Prize, they gave two speeches that contradicted each other. Because Camillo Golgi was just not willing to change his original thoughts on reticular theory, even though Cajal's work kind of showed that wasn't actually the case. So it's an example of how science knowledge changes over time and how much people don't like to change their minds, which I've seen pop up in the question and answer box a couple of times already. And so I love that story because it really shows how someone was able to take those two passions and put them together and come up with one of the biggest discoveries in neuroscience. And we still see it happening today, even in an age where we have cheap cameras. And it's also something that's kind of just part of the history of biology. The early naturalists didn't have cameras. They had to be able to draw. We have John Audubon's images of birds. He set out to paint every bird in America. So here's one of my favorite birds, the rosette spoonbills. He painted Carolina parakeets, a species that's now extinct. If anybody's familiar with developmental biology, so that's the study of how we go from a single cell of a zygote into a fully formed embryo. The first thing you do when you enter a developmental biology lab is they give you the staging charts so that you can look at an embryo and see how big it is and what stage it is. And so for Xenopus laevis frogs, these were the Newcoop and Faber drawings. And with the zebrafish embryos, it's the Kimmel drawings. And what's really interesting is that a group of Tufts who studied craniofacial development, a very common place for birth defects, they commissioned a new set of drawings. And as the artist was working on this new set, so this is some of her work, they found new insights into how the face is developing. This is work that just came out. And so art remains an important part. And then just the idea of creativity, because at the end of the day, this kind of recipe-like straightforward scientific method doesn't exist in the real world. It's a very creative process. It's a very iterative process. You know, the curiosity comes in here when we're figuring out what we're going to look at, but also in how we interpret data and how we make sense of it and how we think of the benefits and outcomes and what we do with feedback we get from people. So creativity in the arts is just really, really an essential part of science. And they're not as separate as people think they are. And then finally, I wanted to end my talk today with talking about science communication, which is really where all of these pieces that I've talked about today are coming together. And the arts aren't just important for the process of science, but also as a bridge to reaching people. It's a way of starting the conversation again with people who've given up, with people who did their high school biology classes and don't want to anymore. And so this is just a couple of examples that I found over time. A colleague of mine, Sarah Adkins, has done a lot of research on agar art, and so using bacteria to create art. So she did a Vitruvian Man. So this idea of using biology to create art. Joel Sartori's work on the photo arc. This was at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery a couple of years ago now. But this idea of going out and taking studio photographs of lots of different kinds of animals, especially the ones that are endangered, not only to record them, but also so that people start to realize that there's more than just the charismatic animals out there that deserve our attention and conservation. The work that people have done where this sculpture was made by pulling garbage out of our waterways to raise awareness about how much trash really ends up in our oceans and how serious that is for our health and wellness. And it's easy to think here in a landlocked state that it doesn't matter, but all rivers lead to the ocean eventually. And so trash that gets left out in Colorado blows into one of our rivers, which goes into another river, which eventually dumps out into the ocean. And so, you know, picking up trash, keeping trash out of our waterways is a really big deal. And I also, I found this in the children's section of the library a few years ago. They Might Be Giants. They did a whole CD on science and science songs. And it just makes it fun and it makes it accessible and approachable again. And so my final thoughts, I really want to talk about the science and the science of science communication. These are big public health issues. This is where we started. And part of what makes it so challenging to deal with these is not just that people don't believe that they can, but because we have some real problems with mis and disinformation. So we hear about mis and disinformation. It's kind of popping up more in the media, and I don't think a lot of people know what it is. So you have information, and then misinformation. Think of it as someone being misinformed. So they heard, I had someone say this to me the other day about the COVID vaccines and the blood clots. They're really concerned about that. And they thought that all the COVID vaccines were causing blood clots, when it was really just specific COVID vaccines were the ones that were leading to a slightly higher chance of blood clots. And so we can all be misinformed and have the wrong ideas about things. And then we have what's called disinformation. And disinformation is when people have nefarious intent with how they spread it. And this is a huge problem on social media right now. This is something that's been suggested that other countries might be using as a way of dividing people. And where this also comes up too is that traditionally, media always presented a balanced viewpoint. And so if you are older, you probably remember watching the news and hearing balanced viewpoints on the news. But now, how do we give a balanced viewpoint when there's so much misinformation and so much disinformation? And how do we protect ourselves from this? How do we figure out what's misinformation and what's disinformation, and who do we trust, and where do we get that source of information? So that's where, again, those epistemological beliefs come in. So a lot of people, for various reasons, go out and say, you're a scientist, go talk to the general public. The problem is that there's research showing that even when we try to train scientists to do this, it doesn't help. And some of the work that I've done, so this is an Impress chapter, a book chapter that's going to be coming out later this year. A lot of our favorite science outreach activities cause more harm than good. And so I wrote this piece on unintentional messaging in science communication and how we can unintentionally send gendered messages, how we can unintentionally contribute to gaps in achievement between people from different socioeconomic statuses. And it all sounds like a good idea. It sounds like making pink science toys for girls is a good idea until you dive into the literature on it. And so people are trying to change this. So this is an article by someone else about the science of science communication and why it matters. And something that I've been working really hard on is leveraging my experience doing research in epistemological beliefs and my experience being in the general public. So everything from, starting at the Pittsburgh Zoo to today, I'm thinking about evidence-based approaches for doing this. So I've worked with the Provost's office here at CU on designing a Coursera course on how we use the science of learning to design communication, just like you would use our understanding of mechanics to design a bridge. We should use our understanding of how people learn, what bias is, what motivated reasoning is. We should use that to design science communication activities. And so that process is called learning engineering. And so I've got my online course. It's free for you to take it. You only have to pay if you want a certificate at the end. And I'm also giving a workshop in Portland next month on using this approach to design science communication. And so I something that I get on my soapbox about is that we have scientists who get upset when people don't use evidence and they're like, oh, you should do this, or oh, you should do that. But then go and fall into some of the traps I talk about in this paper, or go into the classroom and do things that you're not supposed to do, because there is evidence that exists for how to do these things. And it's just as important to use our evidence to guide what we do as it is to use evidence to make decisions we make in our daily lives. So with that, I see the question and answer window going a little crazy right now. So I appreciate everyone's questions. I want to thank you for your attention today. I want to thank you for giving up part of your Saturday to come hear about this work that I'm so excited about. My books are available on my website at biologyeverywhere.com. If you order direct from me, I'm always happy to personalize either to you or to someone else. A lot of people ask me to write messages. Several people have bought Biology Everywhere and asked me to write a message to a teen who's just really struggling in science class. And I also do free delivery in Northern Colorado, or if you happen to be near campus. I also want to plug my independent bookstore partners as well. So buy small, buy local. I'm happy if you buy from me, but if you go to the Boulder bookstore, I'm also happy to support them as well. And again, I've got 2 courses up on Coursera. If you like my Biology Everywhere approach, you can take a full specialization in it and get a certificate, and also my science communication course. And please feel free to follow me on social media, reach out via email. I do a lot of coaching around science communication. I'm always posting Biology Everywhere mysteries to my social media, and then different blogs and everything that I've put up. So with that, it looks like we have about 15 minutes for questions. And again, thank you for being here today.
All right. Well, excellent, Professor Peffer. I think if we return to some of those earlier questions that were linking back to questions about evidence and misinformation, really thoughtful question here from Kit. Kit writes, everyone I've asked about why they decided not to get vaccinated has started by saying, I've done the research, and continued by telling me some version of a conspiracy theory. When I ask them to tell me about how they got their information, they reiterate that they've done the research. Any thoughts on how to help such a conversation progress?
Yeah, absolutely, Kit. Thank you for your question, and thank you for asking this too. So I've had some version of this question, I think, in every public talk I've given for the last 2 years. So what I always say, and what's backed up by the research, is that it starts by listening. And so even if they're telling you the most ludicrous conspiracy theory that you've ever heard, listen first, and then ask questions. And sometimes, because it doesn't work, when we look at the research on motivated reasoning and bias, you can You can tell them how vaccines really work until you're blue in the face. But people don't want to be lectured to. People don't want to be told what to do. But if you listen empathically and they feel heard, they're going to be more likely to listen to you. And also, sometimes you can ask questions and get them thinking, because at the end of the day, only people can change their own minds. You can't do it for them, but you can plant the seeds.
So John, in a related vein, earlier mentioned Phil Furbach, who is a professor at CU Boulder and who actually has spoken, given a CU on the Weekend lecture before on his book called The Knowledge Illusion. In that book, he argues that facts do not change minds.
So I'm going to preface this with, I don't know Phil Furbach. It sounds like a great person for me to meet. Sounds like an interesting book for me to read. Facts don't change minds, people change their minds, is what it comes down to. So motivated reasoning is this phenomenon that we're all guilty of, where the biases that we have and subconscious beliefs drive what we do, and we're not always aware of it. There's a really great analogy that someone else came up with, Jonathan Haidt, that if you think about the two ways, and this is also building on Daniel Kahneman's work, if you've read Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, that there's two ways that our minds process information: system one thinking and system two thinking. And so that allows us to deal with the millions of bits of information that we have coming in every day. So many of our processes have to be automatic, otherwise we'd never get anything done. With also that slower thinking, which is when we kind of slow down and are thoughtful with things. And so Jonathan Haidt's work, I think it's Haidt, he talked about the elephant and the rider. This is another way of thinking about it. We think that as the rider, we're in control, that we think that we are being cognitive and that we are doing the right things. But at the end of the day, it's the fast thinking, it's the elephant, it's our emotional thinking that's in control. And so the key to getting people to think about facts and to think about change in their minds is helping them to slow down their thinking and be thoughtful about it. Because if you just go to someone and say, here's the facts about vaccination, and they're pretty sure they're not going to get vaccinated, they're going to shut down and stop listening to you. They won't listen to a thing that you say. But if you can get them to engage in a conversation, if you can get them to, I have a course that's coming out on motivated reasoning, if you can get them to slow down and do a case study or do some perspective taking or do some structured research. So it's not that I did my own research and looked at blog articles that I liked. It's here's some actual data. Let's talk about this. That's when you start to see minds changing. It's about encouraging people to think slow instead of thinking fast. And I think that's why social media becomes a problem, because social media encourages us to think real fast instead of slow.
So I loved, Professor Peffer, the way that you shared about your own sort of development and trajectory into getting into the work that you're doing now over time. And I think that there's a question from Jasper that might speak to in some ways. It's a question that is a little bit about professional opportunities and trajectory as I read it. Jasper asks, honestly, teaching science and history to people who have given up on those subjects is what I want to do in the future. What do you think is the most important piece of advice you could give me to carry out that mission in light of what you've seen in the field?
I think it starts with meeting people with where they are. I think that's the number one approach I take when I go into my classrooms too, is meeting my students where they are, not where I think they should be. I think that makes a real difference. And also, so you're talking about teaching science and history to people who've given up on those subjects. I think it also, a lot of biology everywhere started because I just listened. I just shut up and listened to what people had to tell me, even if it was hard truths for me to hear. And that is how I came up with the approach that I came up, was because I was lucky to have good students that I continued to really focus on always having good relationships with my students too. And they tell me what's not working for them. And I try to carry that out. I'm happy to chat with you more about this because obviously it's something I care a lot about, but I think it starts with those conversations, with listening to hard truths. I think that's something that scientists really need to do as a profession right now. Scientists get a really bad rap in society, and there's good reason for it, unfortunately. People remember Tuskegee, and they remember the Tuskegee experiments, and they don't trust scientists, and they don't trust medical professionals. And so we need to own up to that as, I think, a group of science professionals as well, and understand why people feel these ways, and then use, again, the evidence to try and figure out what to do with it.
So a follow-up on that, do you think that it's necessary if someone wants to do the type of science education or science communication work that you're talking about, do they need to go get a PhD in one of the natural or life sciences?
So this gets tricky for me, because there's some really wonderful programs out there for people who are in journalism, communications, who want to talk about science. What we really need, and what I'm trying to provide for people, is training scientists how to communicate their science, and to not fall into these common pitfalls, and to not encourage stereotypes. Because I think we need the journalists and we need the scientists working together. There's my interdisciplinary background coming together. If we have people with very different backgrounds who need to work together on these things and need to figure out how to find a common language to communicate. Because at the end of the day, we all have very similar goals. We want to have a healthy society. We want the pandemic to end and kind of go back to normal, whatever normal is going to be now after 2 years of this. And yeah, I think that answered your question.
Great. So we just got a question from Marta. Have you encountered sectorism in any of your research or analysis? Offers a definition of this: the conscious or unconscious belief that some sectors are better, more valuable, more fundable than others. For example, that natural science is better than social science, or that science is better, more valuable than the arts.
So Marta, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm always interested in finding words to explain my experiences, and sectorism is one of those. I hadn't heard that term before today, but yes, I have run into that quite a bit, and I didn't get into that research today. We've got another paper that's about to come out on how difficult it is to kind of span these disciplinary boundaries, and I don't even know how much I would call it an unconscious belief when it comes to some of the attitudes that people have about the hard sciences versus the soft sciences. Just the fact that I have to use those words to communicate that idea kind of bothers me, because especially if you know anything about cognitive psychology, it's an extremely rigorous discipline of science, even though most people look at psychology and kind of poo-poo it. So yes, unfortunately, I have run into that. We see big discrepancies. This is a major problem that I run into, as well as a lot of colleagues that I have as well. There's a lot more federal money available for the hard sciences research than for things like education, science communication, the softer sciences. So all of us are competing for a much smaller piece of the pie. What do we do about it? I'm not entirely sure, but I think it starts by talking about it and bringing it up. And I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm going to use that term sectorism now.
Great. So we've received a lot of really great questions. This audience has a lot of fantastic expertise and offerings in connection with this. And we will preserve those on our end and make sure, Melanie, that you get a hold of those offerings from some of our participants. Several questions, and maybe this could be a good question to end with, because we've got a variety of questions where people are asking specific questions about viruses, about vaccines, about well, sort of these I see swine flu.
There's some very specific questions, yeah.
Yeah, and so do you have any general direction for folks who have those types of questions in terms of a good, reliable place they might go to investigate those, or a strategy for seeking answers to those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a podcast that I did a couple of years ago with AAAS, so the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I talk about what I call best practices for looking at sources. And so I get into it in the podcast. If you want to listen to it, and talking about evaluating sources. And so if you have questions about vaccines that are RNA based, or what it means to be RNA based, and what happened with the swine flu, and that kind of gives you some guidelines of what to look for. So there's TED Ed did a phenomenal video on the coronavirus. And if you go to TED Ed and you scroll down, it will list everybody who wrote it, their credentials, and who did the fact checking. And so you can look for those signals of quality. In a lot of scientific journalism, really good scientific journalism, they'll often interview the scientists that were involved. They'll interview other scientists in the field to comment on it. And they'll always link to the original research. And then when it gets to the original research, it's going to be the original research. We're not all qualified to read it. I'm not qualified to read all of it, but you can go and look and see who funded it. You can go and look and see what organization they're a part of. Are they a part of a major university that you've heard of before? Were they funded by the National Science Foundation, or are they funded by some biotech company that has some kind of stake in the game? And so those are just some kind of simple things that you can do to look for information about that.
Great. Well, unfortunately, I have the job now of wrapping us up with a few closing remarks today. First of all, and most importantly, Professor Peffer, thank you so much for taking the time and preparing this talk and sharing your wonderful expertise and your public engagement work with us. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Excellent. So thanks to everyone who joined us today, your excellent questions and your participation. I really personally appreciate you all bearing with me being in this role of mediating between our audience and our speaker. It's a real honor to give voice to some of your fantastic questions. I would also like to thank Gretchen Minikheim and Jeannie McDonald, who are staff members in the Office for Outreach and Engagement. They've been providing support behind the scenes with us in terms of sorting questions and managing the technology. And also we've had two folks who have helped us with ASL interpretation, Danielle and Terry. Thank you for helping us with that, and also to our live captioners. So you will receive an email shortly after the webinar today. We really appreciate your feedback. We will look at that feedback in terms of topics you're interested in, as well as what you think works well, what you don't, related to the format, related to the way we're presenting these programs. And we will take that into account as we're planning future events. So please take the time to fill that out. This has been the first installment of our Spring 2022 See You on the Weekend virtual lecture series. Coming up next on March 12th at this same time is a talk titled Camping Grounds, Public Nature in American History, with Associate Professor of History, Phoebe Young. So hopefully we will see you on the weekend again in March. Thank you so much for attending, and everyone have a really wonderful rest of your day.